are many different things that you might expect to be discussing tonight, different things you might have in mind when somebody mentions pride and humility. So some of you might be wondering, for example, why we're having this event in September and not June, which in the United States is officially designated as the Pride Month. This kind of pride seems to have something to do with self-respect, something to do with justice. So you might expect that to be topics we'll talk about tonight. Notably, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with humility, which is the other thing besides pride that's on the docket tonight. People would think you're making a bad joke if you say that you have gay humility. No one will know what you're talking about. So it raises the question of how pride and humility go together. But you might expect something totally different. I mean, you might think tonight we're going to talk about topics that have a religious or a theological bent. Pride is a cardinal sin. It's a deadly sin. There's centuries of theological literature devoted to this. Maybe we'll talk about Aquinas, Augustine. And then, since I just mentioned two topics, you might wonder what those two have, if anything, to do with each other. Gay pride and pride as a deadly sin seem totally different. Pride as a deadly sin doesn't seem to have to do with self-respect, proper self-respect, or justice. Or you might have thought we'll talk about something totally different, even in a secular context. Maybe we'll discuss arrogance or conceitedness or vanity or other vices of pride. And on the other hand, humility would be a kind of open-mindedness, has to do with awareness of our limitations. Or maybe you expected something different still, maybe something closer to a self-help, positive psychology discussion about all this recent psychological research on the benefits of feeling pride, benefits for self-esteem or confidence. And then more to the point, when it comes to the PLATO organization here, you might hope that we talk about how discussion of pride and humility with children might help us guide their development as philosophers or development as people. Like, how can thinking about pride and humility help in, for those of us who are interested in teaching philosophy to kids? Should we be focused on teaching kids proper pride and proper humility? Is that important to making them good philosophers or good human beings? So these are all different kinds of topics. And I wanted to start just by mapping some of the variety that we might end up talking about. And it's an open question that we can talk about whether there's one thing that all of these varieties of pride have in common. Maybe there are many different kinds of pride and different kinds of humility that we talk about. Or maybe the way we think and talk about pride and humility are incoherent in some way. There are different traditions. There's a religious tradition, and then there's a secular tradition. So before we start talking, it might be helpful if you'd be willing to type in the chat any examples or types or themes that you expect to talk about tonight or would like to talk about tonight, because the conversation could go in a lot of different directions. And I'd be interested to hear what you expect to talk about or what you hope to talk about tonight. And before we get to that, I thought it might just be helpful to draw a few distinctions with some familiar philosophical distinctions. So we might distinguish value questions on the one hand, from descriptive questions or psychological questions on the other hand. So value questions would be like, is pride good or is pride bad? Is humility good or bad? Is pride a virtue, or is it vicious? And same with humility. Or are there both good and bad varieties of pride, virtuous pride and vicious pride? And same with humility, is there virtuous humility and vicious humility? These are all value questions. What's good and what's bad when it comes to pride and humility? All those questions are worth separating somewhat from psychological questions. Like, what is pride in the first place? It seems to be some kind of psychological state. It has to do with people's minds. Sometimes when people talk about pride, they're talking about an emotion. Like, you feel pride, it's a positive feeling, and you have this feeling or emotion towards achievements, and other things. David Hume, in the Treatise of Human Nature, talks about pride in this way. He also talks about humility as a feeling. Although I don't know if we still use the word that way. So you might feel humble. So maybe pride and humility are emotions. It's like you feel it for a minute or a second, or you just have a mental state that comes and goes. Or maybe pride and humility are instead, sorry, I got distracted there. Maybe pride and humility are character traits and not just isolated or episodic emotions. So maybe pride, it does involve emotions and feelings, but it also involves tendencies to act in certain ways and tendencies to think certain thoughts. And same with humility. It might not be mainly about an emotion. It might be about tendencies to act in certain ways, among other things. So those are just two broad kinds of questions that I predict we'll come back to in the next 50-minute discussion. And then I'll just leave us with this question. No matter what we think pride is, or the different kinds of pride we talk about, it seems like pride and humility also has to do with something important. But it can be a little hard to figure out what the important thing that they have to do with is. It's like fear and courage. Those are other things that have to do with something important, like they have to do with danger or threats. But what is the thing that pride has to do with? And what is the thing that humility has to do with that's so important and that we have to try hard to get right? I have my own ideas about what that is or what those maybe different things are, but I might just leave it there. I'd be interested to hear what you all think before I tell you the answers I've come to. And in particular with this Plato group, I'm interested to hear how you think this might impact your teaching philosophy to kids, for those of you who do that. Is there a way you think that teaching philosophy to kids or doing philosophy with kids might impart pride, proper pride to them, proper humility? Do you think philosophy has that power? So this is a kind of old question. Can virtue be taught? And can philosophy be the way of teaching it? And I have some thoughts about that, but it's not really clear what the answers are. So looking forward to hearing what you all have to think.